Okay, good. Try not to get up and dance.
I feel like I'm in an elevator.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I swear, there's only 8 options, and this is easily the best one. Someday we'll improve that. So we're live. We're giving people a second to find it here.
Great. You guys have been doing some good reporting overall on a lot of different stuff for a while.
Well, I appreciate that very much, man. Just we do what we can. Come on in, everybody. Welcome to another Holler live stream. I'm Justin with the Holler. Hopefully you know that by now. We're tnholler.com is where you can find us, at the TN Holler on Twitter and Facebook. We also have hollers all across the land thanks to your support. So please keep contributing, chipping in. We do this work because of you. And we also have a Memphis holler, and that's especially relevant considering our guest today is Steve Mulroy, who is running for DA in Shelby County, which is the Memphis area. It's a race that a lot of people are following and watching, so we're going to talk to Steve here in a second. Before we do, I want to let you know that Elisa Parker is a big supporter of ours, and if you're buying or selling a home in Middle Tennessee, please do it through her. That's a way to support us. Okay, we can see your comments as you're chipping in. We see a few of our regulars already signing on. We see Alan Creasy, who we know, saying hello. So we can see your comments. We got a few questions submitted for Steve. If you have any other questions, feel free to comment along and chat. Steve, how are you doing today?
I'm fine, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be on here.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate that you're coming on here and appreciate that you're running. Again, you're running for DA in Memphis, Shelby County area. The one thing that I think people need to understand about DA races, Steve, correct me if I'm wrong here, but my general feeling is DAs have a lot of power, a lot of discretion, and people need to pay attention to these races and vote in these races. What's your general take on DAs?
Justin, you're exactly right. The DA's race is the most important race you've never heard of. The DA is closest we have in our system to a king. The DA single-handedly makes all kinds of decisions, has virtually untrammeled discretion over almost every aspect of our criminal justice system. Who to charge and not charge, to charge them light or charge them harsh. Do they stay in jail pending trial, or do they out pending trial? If they're juveniles, do they get transferred to adult court? What kind of plea bargains are going to be accepted? What kind of sentences are going to be recommended? Even more powerful than any one judge is the DA, because no one can force the DA to bring a case if the DA doesn't want to. And Tennessee is unique in that it has 8-year terms. So there is a lot at stake in this election.
Okay, and so I'm going to drill down into some stuff. Feedback now, if anything changed. But I'm going to drill down into some stuff with you. But before I do, I just want to give you a chance to, like, your elevator pitch. You know, why should people support you in this race over your opponent, which I think there's only one, and it's current DA Amy Weirich.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm running, Justin, and I appreciate the opportunity, because I am tired of Shelby County being the worst at everything. When it comes to prosecutorial misconduct, not sharing evidence of innocence when you're required to, making improper and prejudicial comments to the jury when you're not supposed to. Out of all the 95 counties in Tennessee, Shelby County is the worst. In fact, they're one of the worst in the country using that metric. We're the worst when it comes to racially disproportionate outcomes. We're the worst when it comes to transferring children to adult court, which a federal court monitor called, quote, a toxic combination for African-American youth. But most of all, we're worst, again, not in the state, for the country, for crime. Violent crime actually had been dropping in the 3 years before the incumbent took over, and has been rising steadily in the last decade ever since, almost every year, to the point where we're not just number one in the state for violent crime, but number one in the country for violent crime. And a lot of these racially disproportionate outcomes that I'm complaining about maybe are somewhat understandable given that we have a DA's office, which is maybe 15% African-American prosecutors, an office that goes after 90% Black defendants. And I think there are issues of fairness as well as safety involved in this race. And just very quickly to conclude, fairness is something that I've pushed for my entire career. I used to be a civil rights lawyer in the Bill Clinton Justice Department. Before that, I was a federal prosecutor. And for the last 22 years, I've been a law professor at the University of Memphis School of Law, where I've taught an entire generation of Memphis lawyers to be both prosecutors and defendants. And I was also on the county commission for 8 years, and I flipped the swing district that first year, changing the majority control from Republican to Democratic for the first time in the county's history. So I think I have got the broader range of experience to maybe get in there and fix some of these problems to make the system fairer and also to make the streets safer.
So you mentioned the low percentage of people in the district attorney's office are people of color. What percentage, is there a percentage you would commit to raising that to? Like, what's a target percentage that you think it should be? I know Memphis is a majority minority city. What should that be?
So, I'm not going to say that it has to be a certain set rigid minimum. I just know that 15% is way too low in a county that's 55% Black and in a criminal justice system in which almost 90% of the defendants and almost 90% of the victims are Black. So it seems to me that it would be easy to double that number. And I'm going to try to do that as best I can, as quickly as I can.
Just to pick up on one thing that you said that the numbers have been going up under Amy Weirich, violent crime numbers, and the numbers show that's true. And we've posted about that also. We've seen that in San Francisco, Chesa Boudin was removed from office. Meanwhile, in Memphis, there was no recall about Amy Weirich. But what they do is they try to fearmonger, tie you to Chesa, tie you to this progressive movement that basically was, in my eyes, doing a lot of things right, but they try to make it seem like, oh, well, you're just not prosecuting anything and you're just letting crime go. What do you say when they bring up that attack line, which is like, oh, your plan is just not prosecute and essentially give victims no justice?
Well, what I say when they bring that up for a general election audience, and it's all true, is to say that San Francisco, if it teaches any political lesson, it teaches the lesson that when crime is out of control, the voters hold the incumbent responsible and vote for change. And since Memphis is the San Francisco of the Mid-South when it comes to crime being out of control, then I think voters should and probably will vote for change. Now, on this podcast, where maybe we can go a little bit deeper, I do think that you have a point about what you were just putting on the screen about crime being level, although high, in San Francisco. More to the point, there were a number of other progressive prosecutors who got elected or defeated recalls, including in California, that the media hasn't given the same amount of space. But the thing is, I'm talking to Shelby County voters about the situation in Shelby County, and as I said before, crime is out of control. If you want to make comparisons to San Francisco, then talk about how voters vote for change when they don't like the crime situation, which clearly is out of control here.
I've seen you doing campaigning. Has there been an intentional outreach to the Black community, to Black voters? I saw you. It looked like you were walking with the Starbucks workers who were fired. I think there was a picture of you with Reverend Dr. Barber. Have you been intentionally reaching out to the Black community, to Black voters?
Yeah, well, through my entire campaign, I have done that. Like you said, Memphis is a slightly majority. Shelby County is a slightly majority Black county, but really that's consistent with what I've done my entire career. Ever since I first ran for county commission back in 2006, I've reached out to the Black community, and I've enjoyed the support of the Black community. And given that there are such issues of systemic racial discrimination in the criminal justice system, they really are a group of people that have to be reached out to and have to be consulted. And I will continue to consult on a regular basis if I'm fortunate enough to be district attorney. Just real quick, Justin, if I could, that photo of me with the Starbucks workers, I'm a lifelong labor supporter, and that's really what motivated me to march. I marched for the proposition that I don't consider very radical, is that people ought not to be fired for organizing a union or trying to organize a union, which is what happened in the Starbucks case. But that same photo that you just showed, the Weirich campaign took and cropped so that it wasn't clear that I was marching for union protections. They took that sign out and they juxtaposed it in their TV commercial with another sign elsewhere that said defund the police and said, that's what I want to do. That's never been my position. It isn't my position now, but it is an example of the kind of dishonesty, really, that you're seeing from the Weirich campaign.
That is dishonesty, but I do want to press you a little bit on that then, because, I think defund the police in general has been hung around the neck of Democrats, and, we can have a good faith debate over whether or not the words themselves are, useful. But in principle, the idea of steering police resources towards other aspects of our society in a preventative way, to me, seems like it has a lot of validity. So I want to ask you, where are you on that issue of police budgets and, the militarization of police necessarily, and then also, prosecuting police misconduct?
So a couple of different things there. First of all, it may or may not be progressive orthodoxy, but I am going to say this. The data, and I think you should follow the data no matter where it leads. The data shows that if you do have more police, then that does help reduce crime. So I do want to spend more on police. I want to hire more police. I want to pay them better. I also want to train them better. I want to make sure they're given search and seizure training so that respect people's privacy rights, de-escalation training so they don't do excessive force, and implicit bias training so that they don't do racial profiling. But I do also think that they need to be held accountable. And there's a couple different ways of doing that. When it's a police-involved shooting, I favor the appointment of an independent prosecutor, because the DA has to work closely with law enforcement and they have a close relationship. It's hard for the DA to be objective. And the public is either going to perceive that the DA went easy on the cops because they had a working relationship, which is what Weirich's been doing for years. Or for that matter, they may view the other. They may say, oh, the only reason he's prosecuting is he's trying to be politically correct. Putting that in the hands of an independent prosecutor makes it both objective in reality and also objective in perception. But at the same time, let's not forget all the many ways that the police can violate people's rights or just be bad to the citizens other than shooting. And that's where I think we need real civilian review. We have something here you probably haven't heard of called CLRB, the Civilian Law Enforcement Review Board. It's supposed to be our version of civilian review. It's completely toothless. It's completely useless. And CLRB members whom I know and respect will be the first ones to tell you their data requests are routinely ignored. Their recommendations for reform are routinely ignored. And I have already come up with and published an article about ways that we can toughen up civilian review and make it real without having to go to the General Assembly in Nashville for any further powers. So I do think the police need to be held accountable. I think they need to be trained better. And I do also think that there's a lot of wisdom in when you've got a call and you suspect there's a person with mental health issues involved, sending out trained mental health professionals instead of armed police, or at least with armed police. And, to what extent that involves getting extra resources, that's a budgetary decision we can talk down the line, but I do think there needs to be some rethinking. The last thing I'll mention is I did publish an article about police reform in the wake of the George Floyd shooting, and you mentioned demilitarization. I will tell you, in that article, I pushed for 3 priorities: de-escalation training, real civilian review, and finally, what you mentioned, demilitarization.
Well, I think those are all valid. I would just push back a little bit and say, it seems to me that Memphis has a high percentage of their budget tied up in the police. And by the sound of it, it doesn't seem to be taking Memphis out of the bottom in violent crime. So and you are saying that you would send mental health professionals. Like, that seems like a great idea. That seems like it has to come from somewhere. So, I think there's a good faith conversation to be had, but I still feel like, especially since crime is so tied to poverty, that there might be a better use of those resources in some ways. But I get where you're coming from.
And I respect what you're saying. I mean, there's definitely validity to what you're saying. Even though I am coming out on a slightly different side of it, I will say this. Maybe the best example of what you're talking about is the truth in sentencing law that Amy Weirich championed and got passed. And conservative fiscal estimates show that it's going to cost another $40 to $50 million every year in prison construction costs. And, the question that I keep asking is, if we took half of that amount and we put it into early intervention strategies for youth on the front end and reentry services on the back end, not only would it be a more humane system, but it would actually be more effective at reducing crime. So what your point is, we're almost, I think, on the same page, if not quite on the same page. I think there's room for discussion. This guy, Patrick Sharkey, came out with this new book. I'm blanking on the name of it right now, but he's talking about what they call a both and approach, making sure there's sufficient number of police on the street to act as a deterrent, but also not relying just on that, also doing the education and the social services and the reentry program and the drug treatment program. Only by doing the two of them together are you really going to bend the curve on violent crime.
Did you have any thoughts on Republicans preempting any cities that want to require their law enforcement to live in the city? Because I know there were some strong opinions on that one way or another.
I as a principled matter, I really am and long have been a proponent of local control. And I think the Republican Party at the state level pays lip service to it. They're for local control until the very first time that they have even a slight disagreement with what a locality is doing, and then they throw it out the window.
That's right. They sure do.
In Memphis, we had to fight over whether we could name our own parks. It got that ridiculous. The micromanagement from the state was that bad. And this is just another example. There's been a proposal to have the voters of Memphis decide this question of police residency requirements by referendum. I think that's the perfect solution. Let the voters of Memphis themselves decide directly. I'm a big believer in referenda. We have a bad history in Memphis of ignoring referendum results. They did that with ranked choice voting. They're doing it again with term limits. I think letting the people decide and sticking to it is the best approach. And we certainly don't need to be micromanaged by our Nashville overlords.
They certainly seem to do that a lot. I'm pulling up a clip right now because I want to ask you about a few prosecutorial discretion decisions, but I want to lead into it by showing this where you busted Amy Weirich for dodging the question about this. She was asked about whether she was going to prosecute. You were both asked whether you were going to prosecute abortion cases. She said she couldn't make it a low priority, and then turned around and made something else a low priority. Let's watch.
A moment ago,
that's right.
About abortion, as Weirich declined to say whether it would be a higher. She said it would be inappropriate to do so.
So I can't and I won't stand here tonight and rattle off a list of offenses that this district attorney will not prosecute.
Just now, you heard her say in this issue that it would be a low priority.
Prosecuting homeless people,
Yeah.
right? I can tell you that is very low, if not a non-existent priority in the district attorney's office.
You see if you can figure out the contradiction. I'm still.
First of all, congratulations for being very quick on your feet on that one, because I was watching it through and I didn't even pick up on it until you stood up and said that. And then I was like, wow, yeah, that is completely absurd that she just did that. At what point did it click? Did you know that was coming?
I didn't. No, I didn't. I sat there with my legal pad ready to make notes, like any good trial lawyer would. And the second she said it, I thought, wait a minute, didn't she just decline to do that with the abortion question? And because she had been dodging the abortion question ever since the Supreme Court decision came out last Friday, I did want to make sure it was clear to people that there is, in fact, a real choice on the abortion prosecution question between Amy Weirich and Steve Mulroy.
Can you dive into that a little bit? Like, what does that look like on a very real data level as far as, how that will impact people's lives, whether you're in office or she's in office?
Right. Well, so, it is in fact the case that there's a Tennessee state law that was passed by our beneficent legislature at the state level a couple of years ago that says that if a prosecutor makes a blanket pronouncement that I will never prosecute X, then they can take the jurisdiction of X away from that DA and appoint an independent prosecutor. And for that reason, and just as a matter of general prudence, it's not really wise for a DA to ever make a blanket blood oath, I will never, ever, ever prosecute X regardless of the facts of the circumstances. But that doesn't mean that a DA candidate or incumbent can't tell the voters, I agree with this or disagree with this as a policy matter, and this is going to be a high priority and this is going to be a low priority. In fact, they owe it to the voters to make that clear. She's refusing to do that, hiding behind that law when it isn't really an excuse. And I have already publicly said the day the decision came out, as a policy matter, I don't think we should be criminalizing reproductive decisions. I sure as heck don't think we need to make them a Class C felony, which is what the Tennessee trigger law does. And those kinds of things will be extremely low priorities if I'm DA. Now, I have told the voters where I stand. She's refusing to, but we don't need to guess, because back between 2014 and 2016, she was one of the few DAs in Tennessee that prosecuted women under the so-called fetal assault law. So if there's some evidence that there was substance abuse going on while the woman was pregnant, then they prosecute that person. And it was a public health disaster. You had all kinds of public health experts saying the number of pregnant women who are showing up for medical services has plummeted because they're all afraid they're going to get prosecuted. This is not the way to go about doing this. And nonetheless, Amy Weirich went to the legislature and argued for a renewal of that law, a position so extreme that even the right-wing conservative Republican-controlled legislature couldn't stomach that, and they let the bill lapse. So when you ask for real-world consequences, think about the idea of doctors who are presented with women in extreme situations and who are desperate, and they assist in some way for an abortion. They can be subject to a Class C felony prosecution, and under regular principles of accomplice liability, anybody who assists that doctor can be equally guilty for a Class C felony prosecution, which is not chump change. We're not talking misdemeanor, probation kind of stuff. We're talking time in prison. And people need to think about that when they think about, which kind of DA they want to vote for on August 4th.
Well, and I think a lot of people right now are looking for a plan to push back against this oppressive legislation that's here in our state. And, one part of the answer to that is enforcement. And if you want to put a dent in the way that this is administered in Tennessee, then you need to take a look at who you're putting in the district attorney's office. And I think that's what we're talking about here right now. On that note, Steve, other prosecutorial discretion subject I would ask you about is marijuana. Mm-hmm. We've regularly seen bills die at the legislature at Republican hands. They don't even get out of committee because McNally stacks the Judicial Committee on the Senate side. So we don't have medical marijuana here. We're very far behind even red states near us. What would be the difference between you and Amy Weirich when it comes to marijuana in Shelby County?
Yeah, Weirich claims that marijuana prosecutions have declined somewhat, and they have declined slightly, but nowhere near as much as they need to be. Basically, as a policy matter, we do need to move to medical marijuana, and we've got it right across the border. We're here in Memphis. We're close to the Mississippi and Arkansas border, and so it's ridiculous that we've, one side of the line, you've got one regime, and one side of the line, you have a different one. But as a matter of enforcement priority, we should not be wasting our time prosecuting simple possession of marijuana when we should be refocusing on carjackings and homicides and aggravated assault and domestic violence, even drag racing, which has become an issue right now in Memphis. They're all much, much higher priority than marijuana. And again, I think you would see a stark difference in the way that would be prioritized if I became DA as opposed to Weirich.
Okay, so that leads me to my second clip. This is a clip of sort of that line of questioning. Amy Weirich was asked about prosecuting low-level offenses, and her answer was that low-level offenders are not in prison. And I thought you had a pretty comeback here.
Low offenders are not in prison. The prison beds are occupied by repeat offenders, by violent offenders.
Tell that to Pam Moses. Tell that to an African-American woman who wasn't sure if she could vote because of a prior conviction, so she asked the probation office. They said, go ahead. She did. She went after her and got a 6-year prison sentence. And the only reason she's not in prison is that once again, this office failed to disclose exculpatory evidence as is required by law. That occurred in the same month as a white deputy sheriff who confessed to repeatedly raping a 14-year-old girl got a plea deal with no jail time.
I remember when that happened. I remember that it was a similar time frame. I remember being absolutely blown away by the juxtaposition of the two. Can you tell me a little bit about that moment in the debate? When were you prepared for her to say that? And is there any truth to what she said?
Oh, to answer your first question, no, I was not prepared for her to say that. I was actually very surprised when she said that. And I first started to formulate a rebuttal that would, rely on statistics and semantics about how you characterize low-level offenses. And then it occurred to me, no. What would be much more effective would be to give one clear example that everybody was familiar with, because people in Memphis, they all know about the Pam Moses case. It made international news. The Guardian in the UK. I was interviewed several times by The Guardian in the UK about this case. And so it just seemed to me like that's all I needed to say to that audience. A Memphis audience is going to understand, why that claim is so laughable when you've got cases like Pam Moses. Another example of why we're wasting our time on things we ought not to be wasting our time on, when we should be focusing like a laser beam on violent crime. Now, as to the second part of your question, and this is where the semantics comes in. What does she mean by low-level offenses? I mean, there are no shortage of Class D and Class C felonies that have resulted in people spending time in prisons. She used the word prison as opposed to jail. And then there are misdemeanants who spend time in jail for low-level offenses. Not to mention all the people who, get probation and, still have something on their record and fines for low-level offenses. Not to mention the many, many people who are languishing behind bars in our jail who haven't been convicted of any crime, sometimes only accused of low-level offenses, but nonetheless have had their lives disrupted for 6, 12, 18 months while they're waiting for their day in court. So, this notion that this DA's office never goes after people for low-level offenses, which is, I think, what she was trying to suggest, is really just laughable.
Well, I appreciate that you were ready for that. People should know you're at SteveMulroy4DA.com is where they can find you.
Could I interrupt for a second? It's really just SteveMulroy.com.
Oh, sorry. SteveMulroy.com is where they can. But I found you on Steve Mulroy for DA. Did you know that you have Steve Mulroy for DA also?
No, I didn't. How about
Yeah.
that? The main website is definitely SteveMulroy.com, but apparently there are people on my social media or web team doing things beyond what I know.
That's right. No, you're good. Steve Mulroy or SteveMulroy4DA.com. You can find him in either place. He's been endorsed. You want to tell us? I was going to talk a little bit about a couple of your celebrity endorsements you got.
Sure.
This one was fun. John Grisham endorsed you. How'd that come to pass?
This race has gotten national attention because Weirich is so nationally notorious. There was a best-selling book written about her, some New York Times articles about her.
What's the best-selling book? I didn't know that. What's that?
is a book by the New York Times journalist called Emily Bazelon, Bazelon, Emily Bazelon, called Charged, just the word charged. And it talked about the progressive reform prosecutor movement and our dysfunctional criminal justice system. And it took two different examples of enlightened prosecution and dysfunctional prosecution. And so literally every other chapter of that book is about Amy Weirich because she's the bad example. And so, there are national people who have expressed interest, and one of them said, hey, I happen to know John Grisham. Let me share some of these articles with him and see what he thinks. And it didn't really take much time at all for him to say, yeah, put my name down. I want to support this.
I think it's really important because, this is a moment where anybody with a platform, anybody with influence needs to be speaking up in whatever way they can think of to do it. So I'm glad that he did that. There's Charge, the book you're talking about, that apparently relied heavily on using Amy Weirich as an example. Is it Weirich or Weirich, by the way?
It's Weirich.
Weirich, okay.
Yes.
And then the other one that I thought was pretty cool was John Legend wrote about you in his op-ed about criminal justice reform and progressive prosecutors in the USA Today. Did you know he was going to do that?
I didn't. I was hoping he would. He surprised us all by tweeting about our race during the primary. And he just said there are 3 Democrats vying to, contest Amy Weirich, the prosecutor who went after Pam Moses. Didn't mention any names. And so then, after I won the primary, we replied and said, hey, thanks for the shout out. I'm the guy that won the nomination. We'd love some attention. And really all we were expecting was that he would do another tweet. But then we woke up one day and they said, no, he did a full guest editorial in USA Today and he mentions you. So we were very tickled by that.
That's awesome. Just as a last thing, I feel like we've done a lot of compare contrast with you and Amy. And that tends to happen, especially when you're running against an incumbent. But I just want to give you a second to talk about what your focus would be, independent of her. When you think about reforming the office, what your focuses would be. Your priorities when you got in there. What comes to mind?
Sure. Well, for one thing, we need to stop opposing DNA testing post-conviction, which Weirich regularly does, and start embracing a conviction review unit like they have in Nashville with Glenn Funk. And the idea of both of those is to make sure that we're not wrongly convicting people, to make sure that the innocent people are not being wrongly convicted. Because when that happens, not only is a miscarriage of justice that sows distrust in the fairness of the system in the entire community, it also means that the dangerous murderer or rapist or whoever is still at large. So I want to start with that. I'd also like to fix our broken bail system. I think there are far too many people languishing behind bars, haven't been convicted of any crime for no other reason than they can't afford cash bail. That needs to be changed. That needs to be reformed. I'd also like to reform our juvenile court system. We transfer far too many children to adult court where the data shows they're more likely to reoffend because the adult prison becomes crime college for them, not to mention the serious risk they have of suicide and sexual assault. But I think along with all of that, Justin, for me, it's a little more nebulous, but I want to change the culture of the office to get away from a win at all costs mindset where the idea is let's lock up as many people as possible for as long as possible, and we don't care if they're disproportionately Black and brown, and talk more about justice, which might mean alternatives to incarceration for nonviolent crimes. It means diversifying the attorneys, as we talked about before. It means bringing in an immigration expert to make sure that we don't do harsh, unintended collateral immigration consequences for certain charging decisions. It just, the whole mindset needs to change so that at the end of the day, it's not about winning, it's about justice.
I appreciate everything, and I was about to let you go. I just triggered one last thing, which is, on that note, we obviously have a legislature that works hand in glove in a lot of ways with core civic and our private prison system. I'm wondering, how does the DA's office bump against that? Do you feel like they're going to be in this race on her side? because they don't like what you're saying about that?
Well, I sure hope not, but I can understand what prompts the question, because there'll be less business for private prisons, I think, if I become DA. I think we need to, as a policy matter, I have grave questions about the privatization of prisons, as a general matter. But, at the end of the day, I don't think when I decided to run this race, I thought that the establishment, however you define it, was going to be rallying in my favor. But I hope and I suspect that that's not going to prevent us from prevailing on August 4th.
It's a good place to leave it. Steve, thanks for coming on here and talking to us. Hopefully we can talk again down the line. You want to let people know when and where they can support?
Yes. So please go to stevemulroy.com to donate. If you're in Shelby County, you can also sign up to volunteer. Actually, you can volunteer long distance too nowadays. And then if you are in Shelby County, remember, early voting starts July 15th. It goes through July 30th. Do try to early vote. If possible, it's easier, it's simpler, it's better. But if you don't early vote, then the election itself is August 4th.
Good luck, Steve. Thanks for coming on, and we'll be watching.
Thanks. Take care now. You guys have been doing great reporting. Keep it up.
Thank you. So that's Steve Mulroy, running for Shelby County DA over in the Memphis area. Definitely encourage people to check out that race. It's one that has gotten a lot of focus in our state. My general, sense is that Steve's got a really good chance of unseating Amy Weirich over there. And, Amy has been problematic in a lot of ways. That Pam Moses case, I remember when it happened, it was pretty shocking to try to give 6 years to a black woman for voting. And then it ended up getting overturned. And then that same month, there was a sheriff's deputy, a white guy, who I think he may have even confessed to raping a 14-year-old. Amy says the case was falling apart, but I don't know the specifics of it, but it was juxtaposition of him not even getting prison time with her getting a 6 years thrown her. She actually got out, I think, after like 3 months. It was jaw-dropping and hard to ignore. So, he brought it up in their forum, and it was right to do that. And I thought he wiped the floor with her in that forum. So check him out, check her out. Again, just to bring it back to the very first thing that I said in the broadcast, which is DA races are really important, because there's a DA in Middle Tennessee named Craig Northcott who he ignores the law. He refuses to acknowledge marriage equality in our country, even though it's the law of the land. Said that he called the Supreme Court 9 people in black dresses. Like, just when Steve said that they act like kings, like they really do. And there's really no way to do anything to them. I think the Tennessee bar came out and admonished him. He didn't care. He said that Muslims are evil, openly saying this. So if you're Muslim in his district, how can you feel like you're going to get justice with him presiding over your area? So I saw that to say what Steve said, which is, this is the most important race that you've never heard of. It's true. You got to know who's running for DA. You got to pay attention to these races. It's 8 years, and there's really nothing anybody can do about them once they get in there. So pay attention. And I see RLM, who I hope you're a regular on here. You said, I didn't know prisons were private for-profit businesses. Yes, they sure are. And they have a heavy hand in our state. And they show up in a lot of different ways. And, they donate particularly to Republicans in our state. And, I think they have a lot of influence that we don't see. Anyway, thanks for joining us. tnholler.com. Check out stevemulroy.com. And we will see you next time.